Okay, welcome to our next ecology video. Today we're going to be talking about an introduction to environmental issues.
Hey you guys, this is Miss Hines. She wanted to stop in and say hello because she misses you.
I
That's
do,
right.
I miss you. Bye.
Alright, so we're going to talk about environmental issues today, and this is going to be our next big thematic unit. And there are going to be 3 projects associated with this set of notes. It's really important that you pay attention. If you have questions, let us know.
Yeah.
Alright, so let's go ahead and dive in. So now that we're talking about environmental issues, we need to discuss what they actually are. So what's the definition of environmental problems?
So it's basically where we have a factor that is affecting either the quality of the environment, how good something is or how bad something is, or the quantity of the environment, how many of something that we have. And that can attribute to health in humans, so it can impact us in negative ways.
And it's important to note, if you look on the notes, that this interaction or this the effects that we're talking about can either be direct or they can be indirect.
That's
but
right.
It's important. Let's focus on, we could talk about quality or quantity. So we can talk about qualitative things versus quantitative things. So thinking back to what we talked about in our last set of notes. And it could also be direct or indirect. But it always has to do with how is it going back and affecting human beings.
Right.
But we're also going to talk about how it affects other things on the planet as well. And so generally when we talk about environmental problems, we can group people on the planet into one of 2 groups.
Yes. The first group is really people that are noticing that there's a problem but aren't really doing anything about that problem. So they're not looking into what's actually happening and why it's happening. And then the second group is actually trying to figure out what effect is being caused by a particular environmental problem. So they're looking at what management options are there, what might happen because of it, so they're making those predictions. So those two groups of people sometimes act in very different ways based on what they're seeing.
So let's come up with an example. So if I was in this first group and I saw that there was a bunch of garbage in, I don't know, McIntyre Park. So if I was in this first group, I would notice, I would make an observation, hey, there's a ton of garbage everywhere. But then I would just pretty much stop there. Like I would notice that there was a problem, garbage shouldn't be there, but garbage is there.
Right.
But I'm not doing anything about it.
Right. The second group of people might be somebody in a school group that's gotten together several of their friends that organize and adopt a highway, and they go along a highway for 4 times a year and pick up any trash that they see along that highway because they're noticing it and then doing something about it because they're realizing that there's a relationship between maybe the trash and the environmental quality of that particular area.
And so what we're hoping that you guys will get out of this lecture today, and also what we're going to be doing later on in the year, is that you'll be a part of group 2 and not a part of group 1.
Exactly.
Because the more people we have a part of group 2, the greater the possibilities are of managing the problem and correcting it.
Exactly.
All right. All right, so now that we know what environmental problems are, let's discuss how issues are determined to be critical. So who is making the determination saying, well, this is the most important environmental issue and this is not so important?
Right. So the government has an organization called the EPA. It stands for the Environmental Protection Agency. And they're the group in the government that deals with all of the environmental issues. And the EPA has a very specific list of things that they go through to determine whether or not something is a critical environmental issue. And the first thing that they ask is the number of people or nations that particular issue is involving. And so, of course, if there's a greater number of people that are involved, then they're going to think that that issue is more critical than if there's only 2 people involved.
Right. So not only are they going to look at the number of people or the number of nations, they're also going to look at the geographic distribution of the problem. So they're going to look at how much space is being compromised by this particular issue.
Right. And we could kind of sum that up as the where. And we'll sum up the first bullet point as the who.
Okay. And the next one has to do with temporal distribution of a problem, and that's a funky word, so let's talk about that for a second. When we talk about temporal distribution, we're asking ourselves, what is the time frame of the issue? So is the issue something that's going to compromise the health of a local area for a few months, or is it something that could potentially compromise the health of the area for 300 to 500 years?
Yeah, exactly. Something that is spilled that's only going to affect an ecosystem for one day is very different than something that is spilled that will affect an ecosystem for several years.
Right. The next thing has to do with the degree of irreversibility of the effect. So what the EPA does is they ask themselves, well, this event has happened. What is the likelihood that this event can be reversed so that we could not necessarily go back in time, but fix the problem that we actually see?
Right. because sometimes we want to see a return on what we're investing. And so if we think that something is going to take too long or be too involved and it's really almost impossible to reverse the effects, we may put a lot less money and time into it.
And then the next thing is that they're going to look at is the degree of impact on health, the standard of living, social structures, as well as economy. Why are they paying attention to that?
Well, because, people are far more likely to care about something if it's going to impact their health or the money in their pocket or the way that they live. And so that is a big one for getting other people involved besides just the government.
Okay, and then the last thing on their checklist is the degree of international significance of the problem. So are other countries aware? Are other governments concerned about this particular issue? And chances are if other governments or other countries are acutely aware of this problem and they're being negatively impacted by it, our country will then be more likely to do something.
Right. So cooperation on environmental issues is a big one. If it's something that is so critical, then chances are there's more than one nation that's going to be involved in trying to fix it.
All right, so let's go back up to the title really quick when it says, how do we determine which issues are critical? Let's cross out the we here, because who are we really talking about when we're using this checklist?
Well, I think it's how does the EPA determine which issues are critical? Because what this list may symbolize as critical for them may not be something that I, myself personally, feel is critical. I might think that something that is only happening in my backyard is something that is a critical environmental issue.
And that brings up a good point, because if we are a part of that first group, we're like, oh, there's something happening, but we're not really empowered to do something about it, we might have this luxury, this understanding that, oh, somebody else is taking care of it. But the reality is that if that issue doesn't meet this checklist, nobody's going to do anything about it unless you ask them to.
Right, exactly.
All right, so let's look at some examples that are considered critical issues.
So the first one's a big one, and I'm sure you've heard about it in the news quite a bit because it's all over everywhere, and it's climate change. The idea that our global climate is warming because of changes based on human use of fossil fuels. So if our climate changes and we have a warming of temperatures, what would happen? Would we have rises in sea level? Would certain diseases be more prevalent in certain areas like malaria? Could malaria start moving its way into the United States? So all of these different factors under climate change are pretty big in terms of, one topic.
And so what we're going to ask you guys to do is to entertain these notions. We're going to talk about some of them in greater detail a little later on in our video. Climate change happens to be one of them. But we wanted to introduce all of these topics to you because this is going to impact your first project for this particular unit. We're going to have you guys become experts on one of these critical issues. So we're just going to go through briefly and talk about them, and then we're going to spend a little more time highlighting some of the bigger issues that have a little more data and that are kind of a big deal right now in the news. So Creasy already talked about climate change. The next one has to do with biodiversity. And if you look at that word, if you look at the prefix of it, bio means life, diversity means a plethora or having a lot of. So we're talking about the number of species that exist on the planet. And unfortunately, that number is drastically diminishing because of man-made issues or man-made problems. The next one has to do with energy, and this can go in lots of different directions. So let's talk about what that means.
So energy is a hot commodity on our planet. We need it to do most everything that we as humans find valuable. But the way that we create energy and the way that we use energy is often not very good for the environment and wasteful. And so when we look at energy, we need to look at how we create it and how much we use it in terms of the impacts on humans and other species on our planet. And that kind of will tie into nuclear issues over here, because one of the energy sources that we are going to talk about is a nuclear energy source. But really, we're probably talking about use of fossil fuels and how we use fossil fuels in our society and how that can create a lot of waste and a lot of pollution, a lot of bad things.
And I think Creasy brought up a really good point here, is that none of these issues really are static. And so a lot of these issues like energy impact nuclear issues. It also impacts pollution. It also impacts climate change. It impacts biodiversity. So when we're talking about these issues singularly, really what you need to know is that nothing on the planet is independent.
Right.
And so if we modify something in some area, it's going to have an impact somewhere else. And we
Absolutely.
can't always predict what that impact is, but that's what we want you to start thinking about in this class. And so some other issues very quickly, we have environmental degradation, so the breakdown of the environment. We have environmental health issues, which goes back to talking about the health of forests, the health of streams or other bodies of water. Genetic engineering, which was a major topic in biology, either your freshman or sophomore year, manipulating organisms at the genomic level or manipulating their DNA. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Intensive farming, what does that have to do with?
So when we farm and we large areas are just used for farming, we add a lot of pesticides and we add a lot of things that make plants grow, but that all ends up running off into water, and that ends up getting into the water supply, and that can change lots of different things in the water supply. It can even get back into our drinking water supply and go back to impacting human health. So another link there.
All right, and we have a couple of things associated with land breakdown, the breakdown of land and how it's used, as well as land use in general. We have nanotechnology, which has to do with working with things on a microscopic scale and figuring out how those things are impacting larger organisms on the planet. That's a major issue. We've already talked about nuclear issues a little bit. Overpopulation is a big one. I know that we talked about it in biology. We're going to address that issue a little more in this unit as well. Some other things?
Ozone depletion, and ozone depletion talks about the ozone layer, depletion of the ozone layer, which is something that protects you from UV radiation. Pollution, we have lots of things now that are running off into our water or being put into the air that we breathe that are not good for us. We have water usage in general, how different communities, different countries break up water usage of rivers and how they get their drinking water. Resource depletion, we can talk about how we're depleting the fish in the ocean, and we're depleting the game in our forests, and we're depleting our forests. And then we could look at lots of toxins that are being put into our water supply by the medicines that we take, but then they come back to us when we drink them in drinking water. And then just waste in general. Where does the trash cans go? Where do they go when we throw them away here? Where do they end up? And then how long does it take for those things to break down? And what are they putting into the ground and then the water?
So again, the goal of this unit is to start to get you thinking about what can you do. So there are issues that do exist, and we know that they exist and they're major. But do we have to sit around as helpless bystanders and be victimized by what we're seeing, or can we take a stand?
Absolutely not. We're hoping that by starting to look around you and seeing what's in your backyard, you might realize that some of these issues might apply just here in Charlottesville, and that if you're somebody that's noticing, you're somebody that can do something about it.
All right, so let's talk about some of these issues in greater detail. But before we do, I wanted to draw your attention to a list of 7 priority issues that you see in front of you on the screen. Remember, we had that checklist at the beginning that we said that the EPA used to determine what were critical issues. Well, what we wanted you to know is that what the EPA deems as a critical issue is not necessarily what I deem as critical or what Creasy deems as critical. And so there are all of these other organizations that are around that align themselves around different issues in the environment. And we want you to be aware of some of these issues because you might find that what their beliefs are and what they're struggling to accomplish in terms of environmental issues align to what you believe.
Right.
So what's the first organization that we're going to talk about?
So the first organization we're going to talk about is the NRDC, and it's the National Resources Defense Council. And it is a nonprofit group, meaning that they are not getting any money for the work that they do. And they're there to help basically safeguard Earth, the people, all the species that live there, and all of the natural ecosystems that are found on our planet.
And so that list that we just showed you that was quite extensive and long, they've narrowed it down to 7. But again, remember that these 7 are really so intertwined with all of the other issues that we talked about. But these are their main things that they're focusing on. So they're focusing on global warming, which makes a whole lot of sense. It impacts all of us and all of the species on the planet. They're focusing on creating a clean energy future. So trying to limit the amount
pollution.
of fossil fuels that we're using, which goes back to global warming and climate change. Number 3, reviving the world's oceans, which I know lots of people just don't think about. If you don't see it every day, you think that it's this huge body of water and it must be fine. But it's not really the case.
No, it's not. Many of our fish species are going extinct because we're overfishing.
Number 4, defending endangered wildlife and wild places. And what do we mean by wild places? I think that people know the whole endangered wildlife part.
Well, there are certain places in our country that are deemed as protected, and that means that some governmental organization has said that that particular area and that boundary is a safe wild place. And we have different levels of those, and we have different names for them, but some of them you've probably heard of: national parks and national forests. We even have state parks that are run by the state instead of the federal government. So all of those places would fall under what we call wild places. They have some kind of value in being left the way that they are.
Number 5, protecting our health by preventing pollution, which makes sense. Number 6, ensuring safe and sufficient water. Water keeps coming up over and over.
Water's a big one.
And then the last one that they're really focusing on is fostering sustainable communities. And in your bell ringer, you had to learn about sustainability. So let's just talk about it really quickly to make sure everybody's on the same page. So what do we mean when we're talking about fostering or developing sustainable communities?
Well, sustainable means that basically that it can function on its own independently. And when we talk about communities being sustainable, we mean that that particular community has its own food sourcing, has its own water sourcing, and doesn't really need to bring things in from thousands of miles away. And that if anything happened, that community could continue to function and be healthy without, things from far away.
And so something to think about there is that these types of communities require a lot of planning. They require people being proactive and aware of where things are coming from and how things are being used.
Mm-hmm. So a big word that often gets used with sustainable is local, because the more that we can source things locally, the less we have to depend on, using fossil fuels to truck stuff in and depending on other communities for water, the healthier we will be if anything should happen.
Okay, so now that we know where the NRDC stands, let's talk about some specifics. The first specific that we want to talk about has to do with water, specifically water scarcity. Now, there's an organization called the World Health Organization, generally referred to as the WHO, that have developed a lot of literature around this and spent a lot of time and energy and money to try to educate people about water scarcity. Most people, particularly in this country, take water for granted.
Yeah.
You turn on the faucet and what do you expect to come out?
Water and clean water.
Clean water. But the reality is that the World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 3 people on every continent, including our own, lack access to potable water, or water that's clean and that you can drink without fear.
Yes.
And what they're saying about that is that 1 in 3 number is only going to get worse because the number of people, overpopulation, and the rise in demand for water use.
Yes. And a lot of communities that are very poor communities don't have the ability to build big facilities to clean water. And if you don't have a big facility that's cleaning the water, then individuals are responsible for making water drinkable. And that takes time and that takes education that a lot of people don't have. If you went out and drank the water in the Rivanna or in the reservoir, you would probably get sick because that water is not clean. It's not sanitary. And so to make potable drinking water, you really need to have the knowledge and also the facilities, which lots of places in the world don't have.
That's true. And because water is such a scarce commodity, there are right now in different parts of the world wars breaking out. People are actually fighting, and they're fighting not for land, they're not fighting for money, they're not fighting for any other type of resource. The only reason why they're fighting is to have access to good, clean drinking water,
right?
Which is pretty crazy because, any one of us could go out to a gas station or a corner market, and what do we often buy?
Bottled water.
And we just don't even think about it.
That's right.
All right, the next big one, which we already alluded to, is climate change. So let's talk about that.
So climate change, again, is the belief that our global climate is warming because of production of greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases are gases like carbon dioxide and methane that are being produced as a byproduct or as a waste product in factories and other sort of industrial processes. And when they start to build up in our climate, they help to keep in all of that warmth from the sun, and that makes our global climate start to go higher. And when that happens, lots of bad things start to happen in relation to that. Like a lot of our ice caps are melting. And when ice caps melt, where does that water go?
The sea levels rise, and so coastal areas will start to disappear. And there are many islands that have already disappeared, and the indigenous people on that island are now displaced.
That's right.
Which is pretty scary. So now that we know what climate change actually is, there are some important questions that we want you to start thinking about around this particular topic. And these are as simple as, what can you do about climate change?
Yeah.
How bad is it really? Because there's lots of information, there's lots of movies out. Not all of them have very good science.
That's right.
So we have to ask ourselves, how bad is it really? And then another really important question is, why do so many people think that climate change isn't real?
That is a really good question. Are they looking at real science, and are they making sure that the studies that they are reading are good science, good experiments with good experimental design?
Right. And so what we don't want you to come away from this lecture thinking to yourself that there's only bad news and that the earth is not sustainable and there's nothing that we can do as a species to help move it in a new direction. There is some good news, and the good news is that despite all of these changes that are taking place pretty rapidly, there are things that can be done now in terms of education, in terms of changing the way that we use resources, in terms of changing the way that we allocate funding, to cause this change to decrease and maybe ultimately stop.
And I think that a big takeaway here is, very soon you all will be voters, and your vote means that you have a influence on the way people who are in power use their power. And so your vote matters, and what your opinion is therefore matters. So it's important that you have a background knowledge of these kind of issues so that you can help influence things for the good instead of for the evil.
All right. The next topic that we want to talk about is kind of the big one, biodiversity. And as biologists, this is something that time and time again we talk about in classes, and it's near and dear to our heart, as are all of these issues, but this one in particular because Creasy and I are huge fans of other types of species on the planet, especially the cute furry ones.
There are just so many. Yeah, they're so crazy. Lanternfish and all kinds of stuff. That we in Virginia live in one of the most biodiverse places in the world. Believe it or not, we have so many more species of plants than many other places in the world, and organisms. We have some organisms, for example, very close to us near in Charlottesville, here and near in Charlottesville, that are only found here. No place else in the world. But the problem is that as we lose forested places and wild places, we lose that habitat, and then those species don't have a place to live, and they end up becoming impacted and maybe even going extinct. And the less biodiversity we have on the planet, really we're just getting more and more unhealthy. It's good to have that gene pool and all those different genes.
Yeah, so let's talk about what's causing this loss of global biodiversity. It has to do with the ways that we're using land, which we talked about before, unsustainable use of natural resources and how they're harvested, invasion of alien species, that's a big one, introducing species into localities where they weren't naturally found, and so there's nothing there keeping it in check.
Right.
And then also climate change and pollution are a big one. When temperatures change, organisms in that particular location become very sensitive to changes in average temperature, and so it can cause major problems. And so if you look at the bottom here, there's actually an estimate. Biologists estimate that 5 to 15 million species of plants, animals, and microorganisms exist on the earth today. Many of those have not been identified. They haven't been found.
Some we don't even know of yet.
So 5 to 15 million different types of species exist on the planet. Probably 75% of those have not been found yet.
That's right.
So if that's the case, we don't really know how many organisms we're truly losing, which is the scary part. So there are things that have been here and that are going to leave before they've ever been found by us, which is pretty sad.
It is. It's very scary.
So let's talk about some statistics around that. So if you look at the very top, there's some general statistics about the threat of extinction. 1 in 8 bird species that exist on this planet are threatened to no longer be here. 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 4 conifers, trees, we're talking about big, beautiful trees, 1 in 4 of them are in jeopardy of no longer being on our planet. And once they're gone, the sad thing is they're gone forever.
That's right.
1 in 3 amphibians, that's scary. And then even scarier, for those of you who love turtles, 6 in 7 marine turtles are at threat of extinction currently because of practices that not only we're doing in this country but also in other countries. So it's something to really, it's hard to wrap your mind around.
Yeah, and then one that hits even closer to home is that 75% of our agricultural diversity has been lost. We used to have hundreds of different kinds of potatoes that were grown around the world, and now we rely on maybe 2 or 3 kinds of potatoes. So if something were to happen to those potatoes, those 3, we would be in trouble. Whereas before, 3 out of 100 is not bad, but 3 out of 3, that would mean big famine, big hunger for lots of different places. So we've lost a tremendous amount of our safety in terms of food because we don't have the diversity anymore.
And then if you look next, 75% of the world's fisheries are fully or overexploited. Did you guys know that 90% of the big fish, 90% of the big fish that were once found in our oceans are gone?
Yeah.
And they're never coming back.
That's it.
And often, some people say, oh, it's a normal cycle. But really, of that 90%, a significant portion are no longer on this planet anymore because of misuse by us.
Right.
And then lastly, up to 70% of the world's known species risk extinction if the global temperature rises by just 3.5 degrees Celsius.
And that doesn't seem like a lot. 3.5 doesn't seem like a lot. You probably wouldn't even notice it if we rose that temperature in the classroom by 3.5 degrees. But in terms of species and ice caps and global ocean currents, that 3.5 degrees means the difference between life and death for a lot of organisms on our planet.
70%. That's a crazy value. All right, so here quickly we wanted to show you a graph, a representation. So instead of talking about it in words, here's a picture showing you the number of species that actually exist right now that we're aware of for different organisms on the planet, ranging anywhere from birds to amphibians to mammals, all the way down to conifers that we've talked about before. And if you look at the colorations, you'll notice that we're least concerned about the group that you see in green.
Right.
So some people would say, well, that's most of the column. We're not doing so bad. But if you start to look at the other colors, if you start to look at how many are threatened, so they're vulnerable, they're endangered, they're critically endangered, and then how many organisms are now currently extinct. And if we take that and we pull it out, that information, we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about species, whole groups,
whole groups
that no longer exist anymore. If you look at birds, there are whole groups of bird species that just, we're never going to see them again.
Yeah.
Whole groups of mammals that will never appear on the planet again. And with amphibians, the same thing is true. And the rate for amphibians is actually drastically increasing due to climate change and other factors.
And that's pretty alarming because it has been shown that amphibians are a good indicator species of overall health of our environment. And when they start to look sick, studies have shown that humans start to look sick. And so looking at amphibians and how much they're declining should tell us big things about our environment, that we are not moving in the right direction.
And think back to that previous statistic, 1 in 3 amphibians is currently in danger of becoming extinct.
That's right.
1 in 3. So what does that say about our health as a species and the health of the planet in general? Some interesting things to think about.
That's right.
So now that we've given you some general information about some issues, some environmental problems, we want you guys to, number one, we want you to take what we've talked about and we want you to think about it. That's the main thing. Because too often we move through the world on a daily basis. We have a lot going on. We don't think about the world that we move through. But the reality is that if you're not thinking about it and you're relying on somebody else to do it, but they're doing the same thing, nothing will be done.
That's right. And the second thing, besides just thinking about it, that we want you to do is we want you to educate yourself, because educating yourself is key for you to understand what's really going on and for you to be able to figure out what to do about it. So educating yourself and others is the next big thing.
So after we have the thinking about it and the education part, we still want you to be a part of, remember, the second group of people. We don't want you to just say, oh, there's an issue, and then tell other people about that issue. What we want you to do is act on it.
Right.
So we want you to be proactive. What can you do today? What can you do tomorrow? What can you do in 3 weeks to make a difference?
Well, I think the first thing is to educate others. If you find out something is going on, if you don't tell anybody else, no one else is ever going to do anything about it. So educating others about these issues is big. As a society, we need to understand what's going on so that we can do something about it. So that's the first one, is learning enough and teaching other people enough so that you have a critical mass of people who are willing to be activists, to be proactive.
Some other things that you can think about are just simple changes that you can make at home. So water scarcity was one of the first things that we really dove into and talked about in great detail. And some of you might be thinking, well, there's nothing I can do to help with the water scarcity issue, but it's not true. Think about your lifestyle.
How many of you leave the faucet running while you brush your teeth? What a waste of water that is. Think about all of those people in the world who don't even have enough water to drink. So that's very minor, small thing that you can do to make a big difference.
Okay. And then what's one more thing that we can talk about in terms of acting out to make a difference?
Driving less, taking more public transportation. The more we can share fossil fuel usage among many people, the less impact we're having on climate change because we're putting less pollution into the atmosphere.
And this is something that you guys can act on today because we're lucky enough in the city of Charlottesville. As a high school student, you guys all have bus passes, so you have access to public transportation both inside the city and also in pretty close limits in Albemarle.
Yeah.
So when you guys are going to hang out with a friend, do you have to get your parents to drive you there? Can you walk?
Right.
Can you ride your bike?
Could you carpool?
Could you take public transportation?
All of those things are better than driving by yourself.
All right, so now that we've talked about this, what we want you to go back and do in your Cornell notes, we want you to come up with some big questions, some main ideas, write them down on the left-hand side, and then before you turn in your notes for a grade, the last thing that we need you to do is to come up with a summary. Remember, in order to get full credit for your summary has to be at least 5 sentences in length.
5 sentences. 5 good sentences.
All right, thanks guys.